Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. Today, my colleague and co-host Sam Wan can't join us. Some midterm elections are more historic than others. This is certainly how the 2018 midterms felt, which took place right in the middle of Donald Trump's first term as president of the United States. One notable feature of the midterms, which we will never forget from the 2019 State of the Union, was the huge influx of female candidates who entered into the House and Senate. Some incredibly powerful figures have emerged in the past few months, from AOC to others who have been working under the leadership of Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. This is a generation that will make its mark and has brought back some memories of other years when there were many female candidates who entered into Congress, such as 1992, which was called the Year of the Woman, as well as in the early 70s when figures such as Bella Abzug loomed large and now have been captured on the television show Mrs. America for their role in the battle over the ERA. What's the experience been of the class of 2018? What's happened while they were in office? What kind of mark are they making on Washington? Today, to discuss this, we are fortunate to have Jennifer Steinhauer of the New York Times. Jennifer has been a reporter for the Times since 1994, working in the Metro, Business, and National Desk. Serving also as City Hall Bureau Chief and Los Angeles Bureau Chief before moving to DC in 2010. She's the author of a novel, 2 cookbooks, and what we're discussing today, The Firsts, the inside story of women shaping Congress, which is now out with Algonquin Books. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, maybe we can just start, if you can talk a little bit about what was distinct about the class of 2018 in terms of its gender composition, and maybe how it compares with some of these other classes I mentioned, such as the class of 92.
Yes, well, for one thing, from a more kind of short-term perspective, I tend to think of the 2018 midterm as sort of the capstone from the era that began in 2010 when the Tea Party wave hit and Republicans took over the House, and they came to Washington with this idea of changing Washington and moving their own party at that time to a more populist, that time was more focused on debt, obviously, and public programs, and what ultimately rolled down the line and morphed into Trumpism, which I think we can all agree is basically what the Republican Party in contemporary moment has become, the party of Donald Trump, that was obviously validated by his election in 2016. And then in 2018, you had this large number of Democrats, and many of them women, many of them who came to run for the first time, come out and sort of in a response to that. Part of it was a response to Republicans and their attempts, ultimately unsuccessful, at least through legislation, to undo the Affordable Care Act. And part of it was indirect opposition to Donald Trump, particularly by women who were appealing to other women, including independent Republican women in the suburbs, who had really turned against him, were turned off by him. So that was sort of the context for that election. In a broader historical context, they remind me a lot of some of the women that you've mentioned in the 70s, in the sense, the most obvious comparisons when you talk about Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm, who have been memorialized so interestingly in Mrs. America, as you pointed out. You also had women who took Republican seats in more moderate or even Republican districts, who reflect some aspects of that era too, because it was a heterogeneous group of women who ran then as well. But prior to the 70s, the vast majority of women who served in Congress, and it was only a handful, from years since Jeanette Rankin won in 1917, 1 here, 2 here, 3 here, the vast majority took their husband's seats, their dead husband's seats. They weren't really viewed as a threat to the institution, or even through the context of women candidates, even though, of course, Jeanette Rankin was incredibly groundbreaking and a suffragist herself. So when the 70s came along, you had women who were running on their own rights in response to something, response to the feminist movement, in response to the Vietnam War and so forth. And so that was more a better parallel to now, I think. Women running for the first time in many cases, women running in direct response to the political climate of the day, and women to some degree indeed running as women.
And well, was the gender an issue? Meaning, were this class, did they run with there being female candidates as part of the campaign, or are we at a point where it just so happens we had a big influx of female candidates? Kind of where are we historically?
Well, if you go back to the Women's March that happened after the 2016 election, it's hard not to infer that there was a gender component to some of these women running, even if they weren't using that in their campaigns. Certainly, you can see how women who were disenchanted with Donald Trump might have been considered ripe for voting for women as in response to that. I think that a couple things. Women did appeal to women, even if it wasn't by saying, hey, I'm a woman, vote for a woman. They found some connections with them and used them in the campaign. I think a lot about Alyssa Slotkin in Central Michigan and how she understood that she was going to have to appeal to Republican women. That was going to have to be part of her base to get over the line to beat a Republican. And she didn't go out and say, hey, I'm a woman, but she was appealing to women specifically. She was targeting them. She was targeting them even in little micro advertisings at the gas station, where she knew they would be, women would be pumping gas, these little ads. She would have, for women who didn't want to stand against their husbands, who were supporting the Republican incumbent, she would have book clubs, which were actually organizational meetings with other women. And she relied on other women in ways that campaigns tend to rely most, like on college students, to volunteer. She got, stay-at-home moms and other types of middle-aged women to be part of that campaign, which then validated her, with other women. So I think that's a way that women use their gender, if you will. And I also think that, for many years in politics, and we even saw this with Hillary Clinton sometimes in the early days, there was an effort by women to subvert that part to appeal to a broader electorate. And of course, it's still very difficult, especially in primary sexism is a part of campaigns. We can't deny that. But I think women now, in a lot of cases, feel very comfortable, whether they're projecting as mothers. They're not trying to run away from the women who they're not trying to dress like men. They're not trying to hide their sexuality if they're gay, for example, where they might have 10 years ago tried to press that down. So I think women running authentically as women, you saw more of in 2018, but it's not, even when they didn't necessarily even mention that any gender in their campaigning.
And then before we jump into some of the figures in the book who you follow, can you just tell us how you wrote the book? I mean, when did you start thinking of doing this, and how did you go about collecting the research for this?
Yeah, sure. So I came to Washington, as you mentioned, in 2010 for the purpose of covering Congress, and kind of covered Congress and adjacent issues for most of the time that I've been here. And spent a lot of time on the Hill, even when I was doing other topics. And I got a call from an editor at Algonquin shortly after the women won, because she was very interested in learning more about some of these women that the country didn't know much about, who were suddenly, interestingly, catapulted onto the national stage, which is pretty unusual for freshmen in the House, even in the majority. So I would say it was three things. One, I did kind of rely on my knowledge of Congress and how to get around and everything to find these women, and, as I like to say, basically stalk them as they moved about from, orientation in November after that election on through their swearing in their first year. Spent some time with many of them back in their home districts, which is always very informative, and time in their offices and so forth, and some more than others, obviously, and watching them in hearings in the House and everything, just kind of lived on Capitol Hill. I would sort of go home every night in the metro and look, and if I didn't have 4 miles on my steps, I knew that was not a good reporting day, because that was what it took really to kind of follow them around in such large numbers for a year.
And who are, you mentioned a couple, but who are just a few of the most interesting figures who you discovered during this time?
So some of them were not known to anybody, who have become more of household names, or if not household names, certainly know more among people who follow politics. Like in the beginning, of course, everybody was focused on the so-called squad. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as you mentioned, Ayanna Pressley from Boston, who I always thought and continue to think really stands apart from them in a sense. She had been elected. She was a long-serving member of the City Council of Boston, a little bit more of an institutionalist. Rashida Tlaib from Detroit, who was a community activist. She, along with Ilhan Omar from Minneapolis, were the first two Muslim women to be elected to Congress. And they got a lot of attention, partly because they came into Donald Trump's crosshairs. And he really elevated them, and the Republican Party sort of elevated them, even as liberal Democrats really were enchanted by them. I was surprised in the beginning, and I continue to be, that there hasn't been more national attention paid to Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland, both the two first Native American women from Kansas City, Kansas, and New Mexico, respectively. They're different in many ways. Their districts are different. They're in a different generation, but they had formed a very close bond. And I would say that their presence there has been incredibly important to Native American women, who are usually, very underrepresented in our halls of Congress and sort of overlooked legislatively in our culture. People know her now, but they didn't at first at all pay attention to Katie Porter. She's from Southern California. She also be a female Republican, an acolyte of Elizabeth Warren. She kind of tears it up in hearings. She's got a very kind of saucy personality. And I think people have come to know her more, but for a long time, she was really in the shadows, but always very interesting to me. And of course, the women who are in the national security space, whose profiles became elevated when they were pushing for impeachment finally after resisting it for so long. I'm speaking, of course, of Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, Elaine Luria also from Virginia, Alyssa Slotkin, we mentioned from Michigan, and Christy Houlihan from Pennsylvania, Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey. These are women who had a service or veteran background, and they are, and I would argue, in my view, more of a squad, an actual true squad in the way they communicate and work together and spend a lot of time kind of as a bond.
And one of the things you write about, which is always fascinating studying the history of Congress, is the transition from being a first-time candidate, winning office, the excitement and the experience that comes with that, and then you have to transition to being an elected official, learning the ways and means of Capitol Hill. What did you find about this class as they made that transition? What kind of challenges did they face?
I thought it was kind of funny. I mean, going back to 2010, I had kind of watched this, and it was very, they'd hate to hear me say it, but there are many similarities. People come to Washington in divided government, and they actually think that it doesn't matter that it's divided government. It doesn't matter that the president is not the member of their own party. They're going to have all these massive accomplishments. They're going to fulfill all these promises they made to voters. They're going to arrive to the Democratic majority in this case, and everyone's going to think just like them because they're all Democrats. Lo and behold, they come, and there's hundreds of other people from all around the country who are also Democrats, who vote differently, whose districts look incredibly different from theirs, districts they've never been to, in some cases really had no curiosity about. And suddenly they're battling for the soul of their own party with each other. They don't expect that. They don't understand how difficult it is to accomplish anything, even in united government, let alone divided government. And they get frustrated by sort of the norms and traditions of Congress, and some of it, even just the scheduling, that hearings are all scheduled at the same time, and you're getting out of your seat and you're jumping from hearing to hearing, that your staff kind of runs your life in 15-minute increments, and that you don't have as much freedom as you had in the campaign, to talk to people. And they all were dying to get back to their districts, obviously, all the time to do that piece of it. Congress is a very regimented, very kind of old school tradition, seniority, hidebound place. And that really always takes new members by surprise, unless they've, really spent a lot of time in Washington in some other capacity.
And are there ways, Patricia Schroeder, when she wrote her memoir, she wrote about coming into Congress and facing all kinds of very explicit discrimination from male members, having to share a seat in one committee, I believe with Ron Dellums.
Yes.
Kind of small, not so small, but things like that were commonplace. Is that still true today? Are there ways in which they're still facing levels of discrimination that become very apparent when they reach the Hill, or are we in a different era?
I mean, some of the stuff that happened with Pat Schroeder in her own book, and I mentioned in, in the introduction of my book, where she goes into the cloakroom, which is a room where members kind of chill out, between votes off the House floor. And there was an old elderly member laying on a bench, and she walked in, in the 70s, and he said, "Oh, are you looking for a place to sit?" And he pats on his face, I mean, that kind of thing. No one could get away with in Congress now, even as you had some pretty abject harassment that what has gone on for years, as it has in other workplaces and institutions. I think that, when women matter when they gain numbers, like anything else. And so once you gain numbers, you gain power, you have gavels, and there's not much people can do about that. They have to respect that power. Seniority is everything, and holding gavels and holding power is everything on the Hill. But I hear complaints from female members all the time about the way that particularly older male members spoke to them differently from their other colleagues. And I had one member in the course of writing this book who'd been in Congress for quite a while saying to me, at first everyone was so excited to have all these newcomers and these women. And then at some point, some of the more senior male members said, "We're getting tired of hearing all about these women." So there's always a cap, even with Democrats, men, progressive men, even too. Sometimes it seems to be into how much power sharing they really intrinsically can take on sometimes.
And then the other obvious difference with that earlier period is you have Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a female Speaker of the House. What role has she played this is a big group of people, but in trying to integrate them into the party leadership, into the party in general? What's her role in this story?
I find it quite interesting and quite complicated vis-a-vis the women. I mean, writ large, Nancy Pelosi, as you know very well, came into this Congress, and it was by no means a fait accompli that she was going to be reelected Speaker. As you know, a lot of people ran, both in the moderate and Republican-leaning districts, promising to vote against her, which a few of them ended up doing, and in the progressive districts saying Donald Trump got elected on her watch, Nancy Pelosi's terrible, we need new leadership, fresh blood. So from all ends, she was getting it, and she had to cultivate all these people to get enough votes to become Speaker again. And that's something Nancy Pelosi has always been skilled at, is getting votes for legislation for herself. She knows how to go to each person, and you talk about power, offering subcommittee chairmanships, which to a lot of people, it's like, well, what's that? Who cares? That's a big deal for a freshman to chair a subcommittee. That is a lot of power, actually, in the legislative process. Carrots and sticks. She was able to do that enough to get over the hump. And I think that she's always made a point of trying to help women get elected. But, Nancy Pelosi is not a Girl Scout leader. I mean, it was so interesting to me. I mean, you are not going to see Nancy Pelosi, unlike John Boehner, and like I saw a lot of women this year crying, in public, for example. Mm-hmm. She has an old school sense about her. And she has expectations of a toughness, in a sense, that's kind of sort of old-fashioned, that may not always comport with sort of the contemporary authenticity of our modern politics. And I with some of the progressives who were fighting against the moderates, who Nancy Pelosi understood very well were responsible for her having the gavel because they beat Republicans and turned the House over. I think she wanted to see those women use their political power that they so strongly had outside of Washington. AOC, huge social media following, big movement leader, clearly, and others. I think she wanted to see them use that for good for her caucus in the House. And I think she got frustrated sometimes when she felt that wasn't happening.
And are they, I mean, the comparison that's often made is AOC, Ilhan Omar, the squad, or whatever you want to call the group, to the Tea Party that came in 2011. And there's often a comparison made that they're comparable. This is the Democratic version of that. Pelosi faces challenges that Boehner faced. Is that fair, or are they very different kind of group?
Well, I think that I wouldn't say the Tea Party movement really fueled that 2010 election. You had people in Republican districts who picked off in Republican incumbents. You had Republicans who won in deeply Democratic districts, kind of along that same thing. That wasn't so homogenous in 2018. People ran on different things. It wasn't this, one progressive political movement that the Democrats who won those Democratic seats, the Bernie movement, if you will. I would say more there's a subset that grew larger over the years of that Republican group that called the Freedom Caucus. And they tended to get together and, always voting no on everything and always opposing the speaker. And that number in the Democratic, Democrats are different than Republicans, A, and B, this class is different in specific comparison, as you asked about. You just don't have that many of them. AOC votes no a lot of the time on stuff. She's doing that right now as it pertains to, relief funds related to the COVID-19 legislation. But she's often almost nearly alone, or it's a small group. It's not this, sort of concerted effort the way it was then. They're really more. They're more, I guess the word is team players when it comes right down to it. And I do think that speaks somewhat to the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, and she's more able to cultivate people. But I think it speaks to the difference between, again, Democrats and Republicans, and it speaks to the smaller numbers of people who are really on the far left, who just have, the other thing is, too, I would say the big difference is, I think that the progressive Democrats really want to change the Democratic Party, and then, in their vision, change the country. But they don't come to Washington to burn Washington down because they don't like government. And if that's your mission, that's going to look very different in terms of how you interact with leadership and the so-called establishment of your party. And that can't be, I don't think, overstated as a difference.
And to just stick on with AOC for a second, I mean, many people have been impressed with her as a legislator, as someone who gets issues on the agenda. For the layperson who follows Congress, what is it about AOC, someone like AOC, what does she bring to the table that kind of elevates her in some ways above many other members of the class in terms of where she now stands just a few years after being elected?
So I would really strongly distinguish, especially in this time period, we'll see what happens going forward, between AOC as a political leader and AOC as a legislator. Mm-hmm. The truth of the matter is, up until now, she's not been a very successful legislator. We talked about things that she supports that don't get much attention, or bills that she opposes where she can't get folks to go along. The fact that she was opposing members of her own party and threatening them with primaries early on made it difficult for her to build coalitions and get people to vote even for her kind of minor amendments. She brought a lot of attention to the New Green Deal, for example, something that a kind of legislation that her partner in the Senate, Edward Markey, had been working on for 20 years, those kind of ideas. She instantly came along and was able to elevate that issue and to put the words New Green Deal, as, again, a climate offering that Democrats had basically been ignoring after getting so burned on cap and trade a decade before. They kind of, making that go away. She did elevate that. And she did make that something that the candidates who were running in 2020 had to address. But when you bring it to the halls of Congress, nothing has happened with that. There's been maybe a hearing or two. I mean, absolutely nothing. That's gone nowhere. Most of her legislative ideas have not really come to fruition or even gotten that much of a coalition on the Hill. That's quite distinct from what she's able to build outside. I refer to this now because it just still blows my mind. I was in Paris in mid-February, and I looked up and I saw posters of her, of AOC around Paris, as like a leader of a progressive movement. This is a House freshman. I mean, to your point, it's just unbelievable what she's been able to do in terms of raising her own profile. And in my view, I'd be eager to hear yours. I think that she absolutely takes the mantle of the leader of the progressive wing of the party from Bernie Sanders, who we now, see exiting the stage. And so I think her power to motivate people, to inspire people, her use of social media, obviously her whole way of being able to use the new forms of media to communicate with all different kinds of groups, her non-apologetic voice for people who haven't really had a voice in Congress for a long time is very politically appealing. But right now, that has not really translated into legislative victories, which is hard for any freshman, but you will see freshmen who've been able to get stuff passed and get stuff into big bills. And so she has struggled more in that regard.
And that's a familiar kind of tension with legislators. The outsider, political scientists have written about this, the outsider versus the workhorse legislator, and kind of the two realms where you can have an impact. But you do argue that overall, this group, you say, helped reframe the national debate over impeachment, climate change, gun rights, foreign policy, and electoral politics. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, we talked about climate change. Again, that was sort of a third rail for Democrats for a while. They really weren't doing much about that in Congress. Even in divided government, they kept their focus on healthcare more and other issues, and not that. So I think that again, she may not have had any legislative success, but there's no question that she forced the party to confront that differently. Look, there was a huge flap with Ilhan Omar and issues around Israel. And one thing that's always, has been sacrosanct in Congress, Democrat or Republican, is this sort of unapologetic and basically unquestionable support for Israel, even when you had Muslim men in Congress. And even though in some ways that became a huge problem for her, she had to be chastised, through to sort of this kind of fake legislation, and it became this headache for Nancy Pelosi. The bottom line is that she was forcing people to have a conversation about what the appropriate, foreign policy role is for the U.S. and Israel, which is just not a conversation that's been really permitted to be on Capitol Hill. I think in terms of gun control, I mean, we saw that. Now part of that's partly just a partisan issue, but that's something else that Democrats have been largely very skittish about, and there was no question about that they were going to do a bill to increase background checks. I mean, when that was led in many ways by Lucy McBath from the Atlanta suburbs, who ran on that issue, and her son was killed and was murdered by someone who shot him. So there wasn't even a question that they were going to do that. So, and even the issue of taking PAC money, super PAC money, and stuff like that, they really kind of pushed that issue too, and really forced other Democrats to address that. So I think they did make some of the bigger issues get onto a bigger stage, and even smaller but very important issues to people in their community. I often talk about the Black Maternal Health Caucus. We've had high rates of Black maternal deaths in this country, shocking rates for years. But I think it brings a certain level of diversity in Congress to make that become, a press conference issue, basically.
I wanted to ask you, we have a little more time. There was a quote that stuck out. It said, one of the legislators said, "So many members can get swallowed up by what happens within the boundaries of the Hill. When I come home, I'm reminded constantly of why I ran in the first place, children being caged at the border. That is so important, but my district doesn't want me to forget about the high rates of car insurance."
Yeah. Rashida Tlaib, right? Yeah.
Right, Tlaib, right. I mean, what did she mean by swallowed up on the Hill, and what was she getting at with coming back to car insurance?
So in the state of Michigan has one of the highest car insurance rates in the country. And, as you can imagine, for people who live there, that's a big issue, and they're obsessed with it, and they talk about it all the time. And she has town hall meetings where if that's not the subject advertised, it's the one that comes up all the time. And so I think this is the real tension for especially newcomers, is they run on issues, and they're very close to the voters when they're running, right? They're door to door, pizza party, everything's just very grassroots, very, very to the level, to the local level, and they know what people care about if they run good campaigns and they win. And they go to Congress and they think, I'm going to try and make auto insurance more parity in auto insurance. They think about these local issues, and they quickly get caught up in the national story. Where do you stand on AOC said this? How do you answer for what AOC said? What do you think about this controversy? What do you think about what Donald Trump said? Someone like Sharice Davids, who we talked about from Kansas City, kind of avoids that. She stays out of that. She focuses really hard on stuff for her community. And of course, she's thinking about federal legislation. What do you do about Boeing and things like that? They have to. They vote in committees. But when you get caught, when you become a figure who's always constantly answering for what the president said, or what your party leader said, or what's going on with the 2020 race, things that probably people at home are not talking about so much, that become sort of, if you will, beltway bubble stuff, I think a lot of members lose their way, or they feel like they're losing their way, or they become disenchanted. And trying to find that balance, I think, is a real struggle for them, especially when you have a president like this one, where you're drawn in every second to, are you going to impeach him? Are you not going to impeach him? What are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? When people are still talking about whatever the equivalent is back home to car insurance and healthcare, obviously always a big one.
I didn't think of that. I mean, it's a traditional tension for members to have to stay focused on those local issues, but I never thought how difficult that's going to be for the first termers with President Trump, who, has such command of what everyone has to be talking about. I imagine that tension's going to be magnified, especially those in swing districts who have to keep those seats.
The swing districts is a very important place because, even now, Donald Trump is terrible is not a winning message in those districts. What is a winning message is I'm going to lower, the rates for your asthma meds, or I'm going to lower your car insurance rates necessarily. I mean, Donald Trump's not popular in Detroit, but I'm talking about places where people beat Republicans. You're absolutely right. If everything becomes a referendum and a stated referendum in answer to Donald Trump, that's not going to be a winning message in a lot of those places.
And final question, what surprised you most about this class as you wrote the book?
I think that I was not prepared for how many of them AOC, we all knew her name the day she arrived, and everyone was, following her around and had their mouths open watching her, and the youngest person to ever serve in the House, among other things. I was surprised by just how high a profile so many of them had. Seeing Jahana Hayes on the cover of Rolling Stone. She'd been Teacher of the Year, and she's on the cover of Rolling Stone with Ilhan Omar and Nancy Pelosi. And just how many freshman women were invited on, to Bill Maher's show and late night television. I mean, the fact, and some people push back against this notion, but I maintain it. I think these women kind of made Congress cool again. They made people pay attention to the legislative branch and think about it, and think about their local representative and the kind of power you can, and its limits for members of the House. And I think that's probably going to continue.
Well, this is great. Great conversation. We've reached the end of our time. Again, our guest today has been Jennifer Steinhauer, the New York Times, and her book is called, it's a great book, The Inside Story of the Women Reshaping Congress. It's out everywhere now. And I urge listeners to get this. It's a great read. And it's nice to read something other than what's in front of us on the news. So get it, enjoy it. Thanks for joining our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And once again, you can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. And you can also go to our website, politicspolls.princeton.edu, with the show archives, all the information you need, and material for guests. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.